It is the early morning of May the 7th, 1840, and the town of Natchez, Mississippi is stirring to life. The sun has not yet climbed high enough to burn away the haze that hangs over the Mississippi River, but the air is already thick and heavy. The people of Natchez know this kind of heat. It clings to the skin and presses down on the lungs. It is the kind of morning that promises a long, sweaty day ahead. Down on the waterfront, the steamboats are already hissing and chuffing, their boilers building pressure as crews prepare for another day of trade. The river is the lifeblood of this town. Cotton bales are stacked high on the levee, waiting to be loaded onto boats that will carry them south to New Orleans and then out into the wider world. Natchez is a wealthy place, one of the richest towns in the South, built on the backs of enslaved laborers and the endless green fields of cotton that stretch out beyond the town limits. The streets are beginning to fill. Merchants open their shops, wagons rattle over the cobblestones. Women in bonnets and long dresses step carefully around the mud puddles left by last night's rain. Children chase each other through the narrow alleys, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. It is a normal morning, an ordinary morning. No one is looking at the sky, but the sky is changing. It is happening slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The haze that hangs over the river is not just morning mist. It is humidity, heavy and clotted, the kind of humidity that makes the leaves of the magnolia trees droop and the air smell green and alive. To the west, beyond the river, a low bank of clouds is gathering. They are not the fluffy white clouds of a pleasant spring day. They are dark, bruised-looking clouds stacked high like anvils, and they are moving toward Natchez. A few of the old-timers, the ones who have spent their whole lives on the river, notice the change. They feel it in their bones, a shift in the wind, a sudden stillness that feels wrong. The birds have gone quiet, the dogs are whining. These are the signs that nature gives when something terrible is coming, but in 1840 there is no weather service. There are no warnings, there are no sirens. There is only the feeling in your gut that something is not right. And then the wind returns, but it is not the gentle breeze of moments before. It is a gust sharp and hot that slams into the town like a fist. It rattles windows, it tears hats from heads, it sends a cloud of dust swirling through the streets. People stop and look around, startled. They squint at the sky. The clouds have rolled in fast, faster than anyone thought possible, and they are the color of bruises. A deep, ugly green. That green is a warning. It is the color of a sky that is about to tear open. On the river, the steamboat captains see it too. They shout orders, they point at the horizon. The water, which had been calm and brown, is suddenly choppy, white-capped. The boats begin to rock. The hawsers that tie them to the docks groan and strain. Men run to secure the cargo. They know the river. They know that when the sky turns that color, you get low and you hold on. In the town itself, people are confused. Some of them have never seen a sky like that before. They stand in doorways and stare. They call out to each other, asking what it means, but there is no time for an answer. The wind comes again, harder this time. It is a continuous roar now, not a series of gusts. It presses against everything. Trees bend almost to the ground. Loose shingles tear free from rooftops and spin away like leaves. A woman screams, a horse rears up, eyes white with terror, and then the rain arrives. It does not fall, it drives horizontally, stinging like needles. It is mixed with hail, chunks of ice the size of walnuts, then the size of eggs. They hammer the ground, they shatter windows, they strike people who are caught in the open, leaving bruises and cuts. The storm is here. But it is only the beginning. The tornado itself is not yet visible. It is still hidden inside that boiling wall of clouds, but it is coming. It is coming down from the sky like the finger of God, and when it finally touches the earth, it does so just to the west of the town on the Louisiana side of the river. It scoops up the ground. It rips trees out by the roots. It takes a whole grove of ancient oaks and twists them into splinters. The sound of it is indescribable. Some witnesses would later say it sounded like 1,000 locomotives all running at once. Others said it sounded like the roar of a great waterfall, but deeper, more terrible. It was a sound that you felt in your chest, in your teeth. It was the sound of the world being unmade. The tornado crosses the river. The Mississippi is wide here, almost a mile across in some places, but the tornado does not slow down. It does not even seem to notice the water. It simply reaches across, a black column of rotating fury, and it strikes the waterfront of Natchez with an impact that shakes the very ground. The steamboats. There are dozens of them tied up at the landing. Some of them are the grandest vessels on the river, floating palaces with towering smokestacks and ornate railings. The tornado hits them first. It does not push them, it lifts them. One boat, the Hines, is torn from its moorings and flipped completely over. The boilers explode. A great ball of steam and fire erupts into the sky. Another boat, the Prairie, is lifted bodily out of the water and thrown onto the bank, where it lands upside down, crushing a warehouse. The screams from the boats are drowned out by the roaring wind. Men are thrown into the river. Some of them are saved by the churning water. Others are pulled under by the weight of their own clothes or by the debris that now fills the river like a soup of broken wood and torn metal. On land, the tornado moves into the town itself. It does not follow the streets. It does not care about the careful grid of Natchez. It cuts its own path. It takes a block of brick buildings along Main Street and reduces them to rubble. A church, its steeple pointing toward the sky for decades, is sheared off at the base. The bell inside it is found later half a mile away embedded in a tree. A hotel, the Mansion House, is a popular place for river travelers. It is full of guests. The tornado hits it square. The entire front wall collapses inward. The roof spins away like a top. The people inside are buried under tons of brick and timber. Some of them survive, pulled out later by neighbors with bleeding hands. Others are never found at all. A school of young children. The tornado misses it by a matter of feet. The teacher would later say that she heard the roar, saw the wall of darkness through the window, and then felt a sudden pressure drop that made her ears pop. A desk was lifted and slammed against the blackboard. A child was cut by flying glass, but the building held. That was luck. That was the cruel randomness of the storm. And then as quickly as it began, there is a pause. The wind drops. The roaring fades into a strange, hollow silence. People who have survived by huddling in cellars or under staircases begin to stir. They crawl out into the daylight, blinking. They see the destruction. They see their neighbors standing in the rubble, covered in dust, looking around with dazed expressions. Some of them think it is over, but it is not over. The tornado has only passed over them. Its full violence has been unleashed on the waterfront and the lower town, but the storm itself is not done. It is still spinning, still moving, still hungry. It continues its path to the east, tearing through the plantations that surround Natchez. It destroys a dozen great houses. It scatters cotton fields like straw. It kills people in their homes, in their fields, on the roads. The death toll will be staggering. In 1840, it is impossible to know the exact number. The records are lost in the chaos. But by the time the sun sets, the town of Natchez will be a place of shock and mourning. In the immediate aftermath of the tornado, as the stunned survivors begin to dig through the wreckage, the story of the Great Natchez Tornado is only just beginning to take shape. But even in those first moments, certain images become seared into the memory of the town. One survivor remembers a child's doll perfectly placed on a splintered board untouched while the house around it was gone. Another remembers the smell. The peculiar smell of the air after the tornado, a mixture of wet wood, overturned earth, and something else, something metallic like blood and iron. The river itself is a graveyard. Bodies float in the muddy water. Pieces of boats, pieces of buildings, pieces of lives, all churning together in the slow brown current. The steamboats that survived are pressed into service as rescue vessels. They pull people from the water. They carry the wounded to makeshift hospitals set up in whatever buildings are still standing. The doctors work through the night, by candlelight, treating broken bones and deep cuts. There is no anesthetic. There is only whiskey and the steady hands of men who have seen terrible things before, but the tornado is not the only force at work that day. There is something else in the air, something that the people of Natchez will talk about for generations. In the hours after the storm, as the sun begins to set blood red through the haze of dust and smoke, a strange quiet settles over the town. The survivors gather in the streets. They share what they have: blankets, food, water. They tend to the dead, laying them out in rows on the grass of the Presbyterian churchyard. Someone finds a Bible, its pages soaked with river water, and reads from it. The words drift across the crowd, familiar and ancient. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and the people, black and white, free and enslaved, rich and poor, stand together in that valley. The community of Natchez has been shattered, but in that moment of greatest destruction, something else is being born: a shared memory. A story that will be told and retold until it becomes legend. And the story begins here, in the heat and the dust and the silence after the roar, as a town looks at the ruin of everything it knew and tries to find a way to start again. The next morning, the full scale of the disaster becomes clear. Surveyors and city officials walk the path of the tornado. They measure the width of the destruction. They count the dead. They map the debris field. The tornado cut a swath nearly a mile wide through the heart of Natchez and the surrounding countryside. It traveled a path of destruction that stretched for more than 20 miles. In some places, the ground itself was gouged as if a giant hand had scraped the earth. Trees were stripped of their bark. Huge wooden beams, some of them 40 feet long, were carried through the air and driven into the ground like stakes. The force of the wind, the surveyors estimate, must have been unimaginable. It was not just a storm, it was a hammer. And yet, in the midst of all this horror, there are stories of incredible survival. A woman named Sarah, an enslaved cook on a plantation east of town, was in the kitchen when the tornado struck. The kitchen was a separate building, a small log structure behind the main house. She heard the roar, but she had nowhere to run. She dropped to the floor and covered her head. The tornado hit. The kitchen was lifted off its foundation and spun in the air. Sarah later said she felt like she was inside a barrel rolling down a hill. When the building finally came to rest, it was upside down. She was hanging from a beam, held by her skirts, which had caught on a nail. She had a few bruises and a dislocated shoulder. The main house was gone. Everyone inside it was dead. But she had survived. She walked back to town through the shattered landscape and was one of the first to reach the waterfront to help. Stories like Sarah's spread through the camps where the homeless survivors gather. They become a kind of currency. They trade them back and forth. Have you heard about the man who was carried 2 miles and landed in a tree? Have you heard about the child who was found sleeping peacefully in a ditch, unharmed, while her house was scattered across a field? These stories are not just entertainment. They are a way of processing the unimaginable. They are a way of saying this happened, we lived through it, and we are still here. The stories become the foundation of a new understanding. The survivors begin to grasp that their world has been permanently altered. It is not just that buildings are gone. It is that the sense of safety, the belief that the world is a stable and predictable place, has been destroyed as thoroughly as the brick walls of the mansion house. The tornado has changed them. In the weeks that follow, the work of rebuilding begins. Carpenters arrive from other towns. Lumber is floated down the river. Bricks are fired in new kilns. The town of Natchez will be rebuilt, but it will never be the same. The scars of the tornado, both physical and emotional, remain. A deep trench cut into the hillside by the wind is still visible decades later. Some people refuse to rebuild at all. They pack up what little they have left and leave, moving north or west, looking for a place where the sky does not turn green. Others stay, determined to reclaim their home. They raise new buildings on the old foundations. They plant new trees. They hold church services in the open air, praising God for their survival and mourning the dead. The Great Natchez Tornado becomes part of the identity of the town. It is a before and after. Every old story eventually leads to it. Every memory is framed by it. And for the historian, looking back from a distance of nearly 2 centuries, the Great Natchez Tornado is a reminder of how fragile human life is against the forces of nature. In 1840, there was no way to predict the storm. There was no way to warn the people on the river. They were simply in the path of something vast and ancient, something that had been building energy in the warm, moist air of the Gulf of Mexico for days and released it all in a few terrible minutes. The tornado killed hundreds of people, by some estimates more than any other tornado in American history up to that time. It destroyed millions of dollars in property. It changed the course of lives and families, and yet for all its power, the tornado did not destroy the human spirit. The survivors did what survivors have always done. They wept, they buried their dead, they rebuilt, and they told the story. That story is what we are telling now, the story of the day the sky fell on Natchez and the people who lived through it. And so we begin our journey into that terrible day. We will follow the storm from its birth in the unstable air over the Gulf to its deadly strike on the Mississippi River. We will meet the people who were in its path, from the wealthy merchants on the hill to the enslaved workers on the waterfront. We will see the destruction through their eyes and hear their voices as they struggle to make sense of what has happened. This is not a story about numbers and statistics. It is a story about people. It is a story about a town that faced the worst that nature could throw at it and somehow found a way to go on. The Great Natchez Tornado of 1840 is a piece of American history that deserves to be remembered, not just as a disaster, but as a moment when the human spirit was tested and found, in so many ways, to be unbreakable. Now let us go back to that morning. Let us stand on the levee and feel the heavy air. Let us listen to the hiss of the steamboats and the chatter of the crowd. Let us look west at that dark line on the horizon and begin to understand what is coming. The first signs are already there in the stillness and the green sky and the frantic barking of dogs. The story is about to begin, and you are there with us watching as the Great Natchez Tornado descends. And you are there with us watching as the Great Natchez Tornado descends. But to truly understand what that means, you must first understand the geography of this place. Natchez in 1840 is a town built on a bluff, a plateau of less soil that rises steeply from the eastern bank of the Mississippi River. Below, along the waterfront, is the lower town, a muddy, bustling district of warehouses, wharves, and cheap boarding houses. Above on the bluff is the upper town, where the wealthy planters and merchants live in stately mansions surrounded by gardens. The tornado does not discriminate between high and low. It strikes both with equal fury. But the nature of the destruction is different in each place. On the waterfront, the buildings are flimsy, many of them wooden shacks and sheds. They are crushed and scattered like kindling. On the bluff, the mansions are made of brick and heavy timber, but even they cannot withstand the full force of the wind. Roofs are torn off, walls collapse. The great columns that once graced the porches of the wealthy are snapped like twigs. One of the most famous stories from that day comes from the home of a planter named William Johnson, a free man of color who kept a diary of his life in Natchez. Johnson was known for his meticulous record-keeping and his sharp observations of the society around him. On the morning of May 7, he had been tending to his barbershop, a small establishment on Main Street. He noticed the strange stillness, the oppressive heat, and the dark cloud approaching from the southwest. He later wrote that he had a premonition, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. He closed his shop and hurried home to his family. His house was on the bluff, a sturdy 2-story frame structure. He gathered his wife and children in the cellar, the only part of the house he thought might be safe. They huddled together as the roar grew louder. The tornado struck. The house shook violently. They heard the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Johnson emerged from the cellar to find that the upper floor of his house had been completely torn away. The rooms where they had been sleeping hours earlier were open to the sky, but the cellar had held. His family was unharmed. He looked out over the town and saw a landscape of ruin. He wrote in his diary that evening, "The town is no more. It is a heap of ruins. I cannot describe it. I cannot find words." Johnson's diary, which survives to this day, gives us one of the most personal accounts of the tornado. He describes walking through the debris, stepping over bodies, trying to find his friends and neighbors. He saw a man he knew, a white merchant named Peters, pinned under a fallen beam. Johnson called for help. They managed to lift the beam and free Peters, who was badly injured but alive. Together, they carried him to a makeshift hospital set up in the Presbyterian church. The church itself had been damaged, its steeple twisted and leaning, but the main hall was still usable. The floor was covered with wounded men, women, and children. Doctors worked by candlelight, amputating limbs, setting bones, binding wounds. The smell of blood and dust and sweat filled the air. Johnson helped as best he could, fetching water, carrying messages, comforting the dying. He wrote that he saw things that day that would stay with him forever, images that would haunt his dreams. He saw a young girl, no more than 5 years old, sitting alone among the ruins of her home, crying for her mother. The mother was dead, her body lying a few feet away. Johnson did not know what to say. He picked up the girl and carried her to the church, where a group of women were gathering the orphaned children. He left her there, hoping she would be cared for. The story of the Great Natchez Tornado is also a story of the river itself. The Mississippi is a powerful force, always changing, always carving new channels and destroying old ones. On May 7, 1840, the river was at its spring flood stage. The water was high and fast. When the tornado struck the waterfront, it not only destroyed the boats and buildings, it also caused a phenomenon that the survivors would never forget. The tornado's winds, spinning at speeds that may have exceeded 300 miles per hour, created a vacuum at its center. As it passed over the river, it sucked the water upward, creating a massive waterspout. Eyewitnesses described a column of water rising hundreds of feet into the air, spinning and twisting like a living thing. The waterspout moved across the surface of the river, tearing apart any boat in its path. The steamboat Hines, which had just arrived from New Orleans, was hit squarely. The crew and passengers had no time to react. The boat was lifted out of the water and thrown onto its side. The boilers exploded, sending steam and fire across the deck. Dozens of people were scalded to death in an instant. Others were thrown into the river and drowned. The wreckage of the Hines drifted downstream, a burning hulk that would later be found tangled in the trees along the Louisiana shore. And then there is the story of the slave woman named Maria. She was owned by a planter named Archibald Dunbar, whose plantation lay just east of Natchez. Maria was in the cotton fields when she saw the tornado approaching. She had never seen anything like it. The sky turned a sickly green, and the air became so heavy she could barely breathe. She heard a sound like 1,000 trains, a deep rumbling roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She dropped her hoe and ran. She ran not toward the house but toward the slave cabins where she knew her children were. The tornado caught her in the open. She felt herself lifted off the ground, tumbling through the air, surrounded by debris. She later said she saw a horse flying past her, its legs flailing. She saw a plow spinning like a top. She felt a sharp pain in her leg and then nothing. When she woke, she was lying in a ditch covered in mud. Her leg was broken. She could see the plantation from where she lay, but it was gone. The big house, the cabins, the barn, all of it was a pile of splintered wood. She dragged herself through the mire, calling out for her children. She found one of them, her daughter, under a fallen tree, still alive. The other two were never found. Maria survived. She was taken to Natchez by a group of soldiers who had been dispatched to help. She was treated at the church hospital. Her leg healed, but it left her with a limp that she carried for the rest of her life. She would tell the story of that day to her grandchildren, who would tell it to their children, and so on, until it became part of the oral history of the region. As the sun set on May 7, the full extent of the tragedy began to emerge. The number of dead was staggering. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that the Great Natchez Tornado killed between 300 and 500 people. Some accounts put the number as high as 700. The exact count is impossible to know because many of the victims were enslaved workers whose names were never recorded, and many were poor white laborers who had no family to report them missing. The dead were buried in mass graves. A large trench was dug on the outskirts of town, and bodies were laid in it row after row, covered with quicklime and earth. There were too many to give each one a proper funeral. The survivors held a collective service, a somber gathering on the bluffs overlooking the river. A minister read from the book of Job. The congregation sang hymns. The wind blew gently as if the storm had never happened. It was a strange contrast. In the days that followed, a kind of martial law was declared. The mayor, a man named John B. Peyton, issued a proclamation banning looting and ordering all able-bodied men to assist in the cleanup. Soldiers patrolled the streets. There were reports of thieves stealing jewelry from the dead. One man was caught with a sack full of watches and rings. He was summarily tried and hanged from a tree in the public square. Justice was swift and brutal. The community had no patience for those who would profit from their suffering. The hanging became another story, another legend to add to the growing mythology of the tornado. But there were also acts of extraordinary kindness. Wealthy planters opened their surviving homes to the homeless. Food was distributed from the kitchens of the mansions. A group of women organized a soup kitchen that fed hundreds every day. The Catholic Church, which had lost its roof, held services in the open air. The congregation prayed for the dead and for the living. They prayed for strength to rebuild. And they began to rebuild slowly, painfully, one brick at a time. The Great Natchez Tornado of 1840 left a mark on the landscape that lasted for generations. The deep furrow cut into the hillside by the wind was still visible in the early 20th century. People would point to it and say, "That's where the tornado dug its claw." The story of the storm became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the power of nature. It also became a symbol of resilience. The people of Natchez did not give up. They rebuilt their town, grander and more beautiful than before. The mansions that stand today on the bluff are a testament to that spirit. But beneath the elegance and the charm, there is always the memory of that day in May when the sky fell and the river rose and the world turned upside down. And so, as we close this chapter of the story, we carry with us the voices of those who were there. William Johnson, the barber, who wrote in his diary of the horror and the hope. Maria, the enslaved woman who crawled through the wreckage to find her daughter. Sarah, the cook, who survived inside a spinning kitchen. The merchants, the planters, the riverboat pilots, the slaves, the children, they all have their place in this narrative. They all remind us that history is not a list of dates and numbers. It is a collection of human experiences, of moments of terror and courage and sorrow and love. The Great Natchez Tornado is a part of our American story, a story that continues to unfold every time we tell it. And so we tell it again, keeping the memory alive so that those who came before us are not forgotten. But the story does not end there. Aftermath of the Great Natchez Tornado reverberated for years, shaping the town's identity and its future in ways that the survivors could not have imagined on that terrible May evening. The rebuilding of Natchez was not a simple task. The town had been reduced to rubble and the resources needed to restore it were scarce. Many of the wealthiest planters had lost their homes, their warehouses, their cotton crops. They had lost slaves, too, and the value of human property was a significant part of their wealth. The economic blow was staggering. The city council met in a hastily repaired room above a stable, the only building left intact on the main street. They debated how to raise funds, how to attract new settlers, how to convince the world that Natchez was still a viable port. A delegation was sent to New Orleans to plead for loans and supplies. The steamboat captains who had survived the storm spread the news along the river, and soon donations began to arrive from St. Louis, Memphis, and even distant Philadelphia. Barrels of salted pork, sacks of flour, bolts of cloth, and tools were unloaded at the battered wharves. The people of Natchez accepted these gifts with gratitude, but they also felt a deep shame. They had been proud of their city, and now they were reduced to charity. The rebuilding effort was led by a man named Dr. John A. Watkins, a physician who had lost his own home but had saved his medical instruments by clutching them under his coat as he ran for shelter. He set up a clinic in a tent on the bluff, treating the wounded day and night. He wrote letters to the governor of Mississippi, begging for troops to maintain order and for engineers to help clear the debris. The governor responded by sending a company of militia, but they were poorly equipped and mostly useless. It was the enslaved laborers who did the heavy work. They hauled timber, dug graves, and rebuilt the streets. They worked under the lash of their masters, but also under the watchful eyes of the white overseers who were themselves exhausted and grieving. The irony was not lost on the more thoughtful observers. The very people who had been treated as property were the ones who now lifted the city from its ashes. Many of them had lost family members in the tornado, and they worked in silence, their faces unreadable. Some of them found opportunities in the chaos. A blacksmith named Caesar, who had been enslaved by a merchant killed in the storm, used the confusion to escape. He made his way to the river and stowed away on a boat bound for Cincinnati. No one ever caught him. His master was dead and his records were lost. He simply vanished, one of the lucky ones. The physical landscape of Natchez was permanently altered. The tornado had carved a path nearly a mile wide through the town, and that path became a scar that developers had to work around. Some lots were simply abandoned, deemed too dangerous to rebuild because of the instability of the ground. The deep furrow cut into the hillside was left as a kind of memorial. Children played in it, digging for artifacts. They found pieces of china, buttons, coins, and bones. The bones were collected and reburied in a common grave on the eastern edge of town, a place that would later be called Tornado Cemetery. No headstones were erected, but the local African-American community maintained the site for generations, decorating it with wildflowers every spring. The grave was a silent testament to the anonymous dead, the ones whose names had been forgotten even as their bodies were laid to rest. One of the most remarkable stories of survival came from a family named the Percys. They were a prominent planter family, connected by marriage to many of the old families of the South. Their mansion, a grand structure built in the Federal style, stood on the highest point of the bluff. The tornado ripped off the roof and collapsed two of the walls. The family patriarch, Charles Percy, was trapped in the cellar with his wife and 3 children. They survived because the massive brick fireplace fell in a way that created a small pocket in the rubble. They were dug out the next morning by a neighbor. Charles Percy lost everything. His cotton fields were stripped, his slaves scattered, his house a ruin. But he had his family and that was something. He rebuilt his house on the same spot, but he changed the design. The new mansion had thicker walls and a reinforced basement. He installed iron shutters that could be bolted from the inside. He became obsessed with weather. He kept a barometer in his study and recorded the wind direction every morning. He subscribed to a newspaper in Philadelphia that published meteorological reports. He was, in his own way, a pioneer of storm preparedness. His grandson, William Alexander Percy, would later become a famous writer, and in his memoirs he described the family's deep and abiding fear of the sky. The tornado had become a ghost in the bloodline. The river itself changed after the tornado. The waterspout had disrupted the channel in ways that altered the current. Sandbars shifted, channels deepened, and the landing that had been the center of the waterfront traffic was no longer usable. The steamboats had to dock a quarter-mile downstream, and a new wharf was built there. That meant the old commercial district, already devastated, lost its reason for existence. The center of the town shifted inland, toward the higher ground where the mansions were being rebuilt. The old waterfront became a slum, a collection of shacks and saloons that attracted a rough crowd. It was a dangerous place, a place where the memory of the tornado was used as a curse. People said the ghosts of the drowned steamboat passengers haunted the riverbank, moaning in the fog. There were reports of a woman in a white dress seen walking among the ruins, crying for her children. She was said to be the spirit of a mother who had lost her entire family in the storm. The stories were told to frighten children, but the adults believed them too. The church became a central institution in the months after the tornado. The Catholic Church, St. Mary's, had lost its roof, but the walls remained standing. The priest, Father Pierre, a French missionary, held mass in the roofless nave, the sky visible above the altar. He preached on the Book of Job on the theme of undeserved suffering. He told his congregation that God was testing them, that they must not lose faith. But many did lose faith. The Methodist minister, a man named Elijah Brown, lost his wife and 2 daughters. He stood in the pulpit of his wrecked church and declared that God had abandoned Natchez. He renounced his calling and left the town, never to be heard from again. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of despair. The other ministers worked tirelessly, visiting the sick, comforting the grieving, organizing relief. They held joint services on the bluff, under a large oak tree that had somehow survived with only a few broken branches. That tree became known as the tornado oak. It stood for another 150 years, until it was finally felled by a hurricane in the late 20th century. But in its time, it was a symbol of endurance. The enslaved population bore the brunt of the suffering, but they also found ways to support one another. The African-American community in Natchez had its own churches, its own leaders. A man named Moses, who was enslaved by a wealthy merchant, had been trained as a carpenter. In the aftermath of the tornado, he was loaned out to work on several reconstruction projects. He used his position to help other slaves find shelter and food. He organized a network of information, passing messages from plantation to plantation about which masters were kind and which were cruel. He was never caught, but he lived in constant fear of discovery. In the evenings, after a long day of rebuilding the homes of white people, he would gather with other slaves in a small cabin on the edge of town and they would pray. They sang hymns that spoke of deliverance, of a promised land where there would be no tornadoes, no masters, no tears. Their voices carried across the still air, and sometimes the white people would stop and listen and feel a shiver of something like guilt. The economic recovery took years. The cotton crop of 1840 was almost entirely lost. The planters who had survived were forced to borrow money at high interest rates from banks in New Orleans. Many of them never recovered. They sold their land and moved west to Texas, to Arkansas, to places where the memory of the tornado was not so fresh. But some stayed and they built even grander mansions, as if to defy the storm. The antebellum architecture of Natchez, the famous Greek revival houses that tourists admire today, many of them were built after the tornado of 1840. They were built by men who had looked into the face of the apocalypse and decided to plant their flag anyway. There is a determination in those columns and pediments, a defiance that speaks to the human will to endure. The children who survived the tornado grew up with a shadow in their minds. They would flinch at every clap of thunder. They would run indoors if the wind picked up. The parents were no better. They developed superstitions about the sky. A greenish hue, a sudden stillness, the sound of a distant train whistle, all of these became omens. The word cyclone entered the local vocabulary, used for any storm that seemed too violent. The children of the 1840s became the adults of the 1850s, and they passed their fear down to their own children. By the time the Civil War came, the tornado had become a folk memory, a story that grandparents told to grandchildren on stormy nights. They would say, "I remember when the sky fell," and they would describe the waterspout, the flying cows, the man buried under his own chimney. The stories grew taller over time, but they were still true at their core. The scientific community took an interest in the Natchez tornado. A geologist named Charles Lyell, who was touring the United States in the 1840s, visited the site and wrote about it in his journal. He noted the peculiar pattern of destruction, how some buildings were completely flattened while others a few feet away were untouched. He speculated about the nature of tornadoes, their rotation, their low-pressure centers. His observations would later influence the development of modern meteorology, but at the time, most people did not care about science. They cared about survival. They cared about finding enough food to feed their families. They cared about the dead, who were still being discovered months later in remote corners of the fields under piles of debris, their bodies mummified by the sun. One final story deserves telling, the story of a young girl named Mary. She was the daughter of a riverboat pilot, a man named Samuel. He was on the river when the tornado struck, piloting a small flatboat loaded with timber. He saw the waterspout form, saw the steamboat Heinz lifted and thrown. He knew his family was in Natchez and he could do nothing but watch. He tied his boat to a tree and ran inland through the rain and the flying debris. He reached his home 6 hours later, walking through a landscape that looked like a battlefield. His house was gone. His wife was dead, pinned under a beam. But his daughter Mary was alive, found hiding in a root cellar beneath what had been the kitchen. She was covered in mud and scratches, but she was unhurt. Samuel took her in his arms and wept. He carried her to the church where the women cleaned her and gave her clothes. He built a new house with his own hands, a small cabin on the edge of town. He never went back to the river. He became a farmer, raising corn and hogs. He raised Mary, who grew up to marry a carpenter and have children of her own. She lived to be 90 years old, and every year on May 7th, she would tell her grandchildren the story of the tornado. She would show them the scar on her hand where a piece of glass had cut her. She would say, "I remember the sound," like the world was screaming, and they would listen and they would remember and the story would live on. The Great Natchez Tornado is not just a historical event. It is a living memory carried in the blood of the families who stayed, in the architecture of the town, in the landscape of the river. It is a reminder that we are not in control, that the forces of nature are vast and indifferent. But it is also a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to survive, to rebuild, to tell the story again and again until it becomes a part of who we are. The tornado of 1840 may have destroyed a city, but it did not destroy the people. They carried on, and in their carrying on, they created something new. That is the lesson of the storm, a lesson that still echoes in the quiet streets of Natchez, in the whispers of the wind, in the memory of the waterspout that rose from the river and touched the sky. The story of Mary and her father Samuel is just one of countless threads in the tapestry of the Great Natchez Tornado. But for every thread that we can trace, there are 1,000 that have been lost to time, buried under the weight of years and silence. The tornado did not just destroy buildings and lives, it erased stories. The names of many who died were never recorded, especially the enslaved, whose owners often saw them as property first and people second. In the months after the storm, the white citizens of Natchez held meetings to discuss how to rebuild the town's economy, but no one convened a council to ask the black residents what they needed. And so the African-American community rebuilt itself in the shadows, out of sight of the official records. They built new cabins on the same plots as the old ones, using salvaged lumber from the wreckage. They planted gardens where the debris had been cleared. They held funerals for the dead that were not written in any newspaper, but the mourners' songs could be heard drifting across the fields at dusk. One of the most remarkable aspects of the recovery was the role played by the women of Natchez, both white and black. The white women of the planter class were expected to be delicate and retiring, but the tornado forced them into action. They organized relief committees, distributed food and clothing, and turned their surviving homes into makeshift hospitals. They wrote letters to relatives in other states, begging for supplies and money. They nursed the wounded, many of whom had ghastly injuries from flying glass and splintered wood. A woman named Margaret Miller, the wife of a cotton factor, kept a diary during that time. In it, she wrote of dressing wounds until her hands were raw, of watching men die from infections that no amount of whiskey or laudanum could stop. She wrote of the smell, the sweet rot of gangrene that hung over the town for weeks. She never recovered from the experience. After the reconstruction was complete, she withdrew from society, spending the rest of her life in a single room of her rebuilt house, sewing mourning dresses for the families who had lost loved ones. She made over 200 of them before she died in 1851. The enslaved women had no time for grief. They were expected to return to work as soon as the debris was cleared. They cooked meals for the white families and for their own, often using the same pot. They washed clothes in the river, the water still murky with mud and debris. They gave birth in the fields with no one to help them but each other. One woman named Charity, who belonged to a tobacco planter named Henderson, gave birth to a stillborn child on the night of the tornado while lying in a ditch, her body covered with a blanket that had been soaked in rain and blood. She wrapped the infant in a torn piece of cloth and buried it under a magnolia tree. She marked the spot with a pile of stones. She never told her master, because she feared he would see the child as another piece of property lost. She carried that secret for the rest of her life, and when she died 30 years later, the only person who knew where the baby lay was her daughter, to whom she had whispered the story on her deathbed. The economic impact of the tornado rippled outward far beyond Natchez. The cotton that had been stored in the warehouses along the river was ruined, and the planters who had already sold their crops on credit were left unable to fulfill their contracts. This caused a chain reaction of defaults that affected banks in New Orleans, Mobile, and even New York. The financial panic of 1837 had barely faded, and now this disaster pushed many firms over the edge. The price of cotton rose in the aftermath as supply dropped, but the small planters who had lost everything could not benefit from the price increase. They had no capital to plant a new crop. The land itself had been scarred. Fields were littered with debris, and the topsoil in some areas had been scoured away by the storm's winds. It took years for the soil to recover, and in the meantime many planters turned to other crops such as corn and sweet potatoes, which were less profitable but more resilient. The slave trade itself was affected. Some owners, desperate for cash, sold their enslaved workers to traders who took them downriver to the cotton plantations of Louisiana and Mississippi. Families were torn apart again, not by the tornado directly, but by the economic desperation it had caused. The town of Natchez slowly rebuilt its infrastructure. The courthouse was reconstructed on the same site, but this time with stronger walls and a deeper foundation. The new building was designed by a young architect named James Stokes, who had studied in Philadelphia. He incorporated cast iron columns and brick arches, believing they would withstand any future storm. He was wrong, of course. No building can withstand a direct hit from a tornado of that magnitude, but his efforts gave the townspeople a sense of security. The church with the roofless nave was repaired, but Father Pierre insisted on leaving a small section of the roof open, a skylight through which the sky could be seen. He said it was a reminder that God's kingdom was above, not in the hands of men. That skylight remained for decades, until the church burned down in 1893. By then, the old priest was long dead, and no one remembered why the roof had that peculiar opening. The river itself changed after the tornado. The waterspout had altered the channel slightly, deepening a section near the landing and creating a new sandbar on the other side of the river. Pilots learned to avoid that spot because the current there was unpredictable. They told stories of strange sounds coming from the water, like the cries of drowning men. Some said it was the ghosts of the steamboat passengers who had died. Others said it was just the wind. But no one who had been there on May 7, 1840, could hear a low rumble without feeling a chill. In the decades that followed, the Great Natchez Tornado became a fixture in American folklore. Traveling showmen would tell exaggerated versions of the story, complete with magic lantern slides depicting flying cows and collapsing churches. A popular ballad was written about the tornado, sung to the tune of the wreck of the old 97. The ballad told of a young couple, a steamboat captain and his bride, who were separated by the storm and never found each other again. It was pure fiction, but people sang it anyway, and it became a standard in the repertoire of Appalachian folk singers. The tornado also appeared in the works of several writers, including a young journalist named Walt Whitman, who wrote a short article about it for the New York Aurora in 1842. He described the scene as a desolation that would make the angels weep. He never visited Natchez, but his words captured the imagination of his readers. By the time the Civil War erupted in 1861, the memory of the tornado had taken on new meaning. The town of Natchez, like much of the South, was divided. Some saw the tornado as a divine punishment for the sin of slavery. Others saw it as a test that the town had passed, proving that its citizens were strong enough to face any trial. When Union forces captured Natchez in 1863, they were surprised to find a town that had already been devastated once. The scars of the tornado were still visible in the architecture, in the rebuilt houses that had a hasty, provisional look. Soldiers looted what they could, but there was little to take. The town had already given its best to the storm. After the war, during Reconstruction, the freedmen of Natchez demanded reparations, not just for slavery but for the losses they had suffered in the tornado. They pointed out that they had been forced to rebuild the town without pay, that their labor had enriched the very people who had owned them. There was a brief moment in 1868 when it seemed like the federal government might listen. But the political will evaporated, and the promise of compensation was forgotten. The freedmen had to start from scratch just as they had after the tornado, but this time without even the pretense of a master's protection. The 20th century arrived and the Great Natchez Tornado receded into the past. The survivors died off one by one. The last living survivor was a man named Joshua Peters, who had been a child of 5 when the storm struck. He died in 1923 at the age of 88. He gave an interview to a local newspaper on his 100th birthday, though he was only 88. The reporter did not check the facts. In that interview, Joshua told of seeing the waterspout rise from the river, of watching the steamboat Hines tumble through the air like a toy. He claimed that he had been carried a quarter of a mile by the wind and landed in a tree unharmed. He said that a pig had landed next to him and squealed all night. The reporter printed it all, and the story became part of the official record. Today, if you search for the Great Natchez Tornado, you will find that anecdote repeated in many accounts, even though no other source confirms it. It is a perfect example of how memory becomes myth, how the story becomes more important than the fact. In the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration conducted interviews with elderly residents of Natchez, gathering oral histories of the tornado. Those interviews are now preserved in the Library of Congress. They are filled with shaky voices and long pauses, with details that sometimes contradict each other. One woman remembered that the sky had turned bright green. Another remembered it as black. One man recalled that the tornado had sounded like a freight train. Another said it was more like 1,000 screeching cats. These differences are not errors. They are the texture of memory, the way the human mind processes trauma. The tornado did not just have one sound or one color. It had 1,000 because 1,000 people experienced it, each in their own way. Today, the Great Natchez Tornado is commemorated with a small plaque on the bluff, near the spot where the waterspout first touched land. The plaque was erected in 1940 on the 100th anniversary. It is made of bronze and it lists the names of some of the dead, but only the ones who were white and wealthy. The names of the enslaved are not there. A separate memorial, a simple stone cross, was placed in the African American cemetery in 1995, paid for by a descendant of one of the survivors. It reads, "In memory of the unknown dead, May 7, 1840. No names, just that. The river still flows, wide and brown. The bluff still stands, though it has been eroded by a century and a half of rain and floods. The town of Natchez is quiet now, a place of history and tourism, of bed and breakfast and antebellum tour. But if you visit on a certain day when the air is heavy and still and you stand on the bluff and look out over the water, you might feel it. A whisper, a tremor, a memory of that moment when the sky opened and the world turned upside down. The Great Natchez Tornado is not just a story. It is a wound in the earth, a scar in the soul of a town. And like all wounds, it heals slowly, incompletely, leaving a mark that never quite fades away. That mark is the lesson we carry forward. That we are fragile, that we are strong, that we are bound together by the storms we survive and the stories we tell. And so the waterspout rises again in every retelling, touching the sky and reminding us of what we have lost and what we have become. We live now in an age of warnings and preparedness, where satellites and radar can predict a tornado days in advance. In Natchez, the National Weather Service has a Doppler radar station that covers the region, and when the conditions are right, they issue alerts that blare from cell phones and televisions. But the people of Natchez know that the sky can still turn without notice. They know that the river can still rise, that the air can still grow still and heavy, that the old feeling can return. And when it does, they remember. Not because they have to, but because the memory is woven into the fabric of the town, passed down from generation to generation like a lullaby or a warning. There is a museum in Natchez now, the Natchez Museum of History, and in it there is a small exhibit dedicated to the Great Tornado. It contains a few artifacts. A twisted iron gate, a shattered clock that stopped at 1:45, a faded photograph of the ruins of the steamboat Hines. The photograph is so badly damaged that you can barely make out the shape of the hull, but the docent, an elderly woman named Clara, will tell you the story if you ask. She will tell you about the waterspout and the 900 dead, about the church with the roofless nave and the skylight that no one understood. She will tell you about the hog that landed in the tree, and she will laugh a little sadly and say that she does not know if that part is true, but it is a good story. And in that moment, you understand that the truth does not matter as much as the telling. The story is alive because it is told. The museum also has a recording of one of the Works Progress Administration interviews, a woman named Eliza who was a child in 1840. She speaks in a voice that sounds like rustling leaves, describing how her mother grabbed her and ran for the root cellar, how the ground shook, how the air was filled with dust and screaming. She says that after the storm, her father found a doll that had belonged to a neighbor girl, and he brought it home, and Eliza kept it for the rest of her life. She does not say what happened to the neighbor girl. She does not need to. The silence says enough. And so the Great Natchez Tornado lives on, not as a statistic or a date, but as a collection of voices, of fragments, of moments that refuse to be forgotten. It lives in the way the people of Natchez brace themselves when the clouds gather low over the river. It lives in the way they look at the sky, measuring the distance between lightning and thunder, calculating the odds. It lives in the way they tell the story over and over to anyone who will listen, because telling the story is a way of keeping the dead alive, of honoring the ones who were taken, of reminding themselves that they are still here. The river still flows. The bluff still stands. And on the 7th of May every year, a small group of people gathers at the plaque on the bluff just before dusk, and they hold a moment of silence. They do not sing a hymn or say a prayer. They just stand looking out at the water, listening to the wind. And sometimes, if the air is just right, they can almost hear it. The low rumble of the approaching sky, the distant scream of a steamboat whistle, the sound of a world undone. Then the moment passes and they go home and the story continues. It will always continue. Because we are fragile and we are strong and we are bound together by the storms we survive and the stories we tell. And the waterspout will rise again in every retelling, touching the sky and reminding us of what we have lost and what we have become. And that is the truth of the Great Natchez Tornado. Not a fact, not a date, not a number, a truth, the only kind that matters.